Breaking news from London and across the Atlantic. A firestorm has erupted in the heart of the UK's political and media establishment. Tonight we begin with how a controversial clip produced by the BBC and a legal threat from former US President Donald Trump sparked chaos inside Parliament and placed Prime Minister Keir Starmer under intense pressure. In this first segment, we'll trace the origins of the scandal, how the BBC editing of Mr. Trump's January 6 speech triggered resignations, how politicians seized upon the moment, and why the phrase "to be kicked out" is now swirling around the leader of the Labour Party. The story begins with the public-funded broadcaster, the BBC, under fire. According to repeated reporting, the BBC aired a documentary that spliced together fragments of Donald Trump's speech, creating the impression he had directly incited the January 6, 2021, Capitol riot. The fallout was immediate. The BBC's Director General and Head of News both resigned amid demands for accountability. Meanwhile, the legal threat arrived. A letter demanding a retraction, apology and compensation of up to $1 billion from Trump's lawyers. On the UK side, Prime Minister Keir Starmer found himself walking a tightrope. He stressed his belief in a strong and independent BBC, yet told the broadcaster it must get its house in order. Why does this matter politically? Because the BBC is funded by the license fee, meaning the public fund the broadcaster. If the sterling equivalent of the settlement had to be paid, the pressure would fall on millions of households watching. Conservative politicians warned of real anger if this happened. As the media storm grew, the Commons became the theater of the crisis. During a session, MPs burst into laughter, heckled and raised howls of outrage at the idea that the Prime Minister was failing to protect the UK's premier broadcaster from a US legal threat. Video clip shows the Commons' reaction. The stage was set. A media scandal. A threat from a global power. National embarrassment. A Prime Minister under strain. B-roll suggestions. Footage of the BBC broadcasting house. Trump rally. January 6 images. According to Wikipedia's summary of the BBC's Panorama program, the edit took 2 snippets from Trump's speech nearly an hour apart and made them appear consecutive. "We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you. And we fight." The documentary omitted a key part of his speech where he called for peaceful protest, raising questions of distortion. That turned it from a media oversight into a political lightning rod. Insert voiceover. In politics, perception is power. When a national broadcaster appears to misrepresent a former US president, it's not just a journalistic error. It becomes an international incident. This moment highlights the intersection of media integrity, political accountability, and global diplomacy. Starmer's government can't just treat it as internal. The optics, stakes in alliances are simply too big. By the end of this segment, we've traced the spark, a misedit, legal threat, political exposure. In the next part, we'll examine the fallout inside the party, how Starmer's authority is being questioned and why "kicked out" is emerging as a headline. In Westminster, perception is everything. And when the laughter fades, what's left is political damage. The chaos in Parliament over the Trump BBC scandal has now turned into something far deeper, a crisis of leadership. And at the center of it all, Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Once hailed as the man who brought order after chaos, Starmer is now facing accusations of weakness, hypocrisy, and lost control. After the fiery Commons session where MPs erupted in laughter over his comments, insiders say Starmer's confidence was visibly shaken. Political commentators on both BBC, Newsnight, and Sky News described his tone as defensive, uncertain, and evasive. Even within Labour ranks, whispers began circulating. Has Starmer lost his grip? Is the Prime Minister becoming a liability for the party? A senior Labour backbencher, speaking anonymously to The Guardian, said, "We fought for integrity and truth. Now we're defending a broadcaster accused of manipulating truth. That's not a good look." This remark summed up the internal discomfort. Starmer had built his image on ethics and justice, yet the BBC, seen as aligned with his political base, was now under fire for dishonesty. It's important to understand why the BBC scandal hurt Starmer personally. Starmer has always positioned himself as a defender of British institutions, law, order, the courts, and the public broadcaster. But in this moment, his relationship with the BBC became a political trap. If he defends it too strongly, critics say he's covering up bias. If he condemns it, he alienates a powerful media ally. That's the double bind. and his political rivals saw it instantly. Conservative MP Jacob Rees-Mogg mocked him during question time, saying, "The Prime Minister seems to have more faith in the BBC's editing team than in his own cabinet." The remark drew laughter, but also signaled a new phase. Mockery had replaced fear. Behind closed doors, Labour Party unity has started to show strain. According to The Times, at least 7 MPs from the moderate wing of the party have raised serious concerns about Starmer's handling of the media scandal, fearing it could drag Labour's polling down. One insider told ITV political editor Robert Peston, "We're being forced to defend the indefensible. People are angry. This could be the start of a real leadership crisis." Even the left-leaning press, once loyal to Starmer, is shifting tone. The Independent ran the headline, "Starmer's silence on BBC crisis fuels leadership anxiety." And the Mirror, traditionally pro-Labour, noted, "The PM's indecision is beginning to look like weakness." This perception is dangerous, especially as the Tories, despite their own chaos, are using this scandal to rebuild their narrative, that Starmer is unfit to lead Britain on the world stage. As this political storm raged, another issue began to intertwine with it. Reports of a toxic culture inside BBC headquarters. Whistleblowers claimed that journalists who questioned the Trump documentary edit were sidelined or even disciplined. The Telegraph reported that multiple internal complaints were filed, alleging editorial pressure to produce anti-Trump narratives. That changed everything, because now, the story wasn't just about an edit mistake. It was about institutional bias, toxic workplace culture, and the ethics of publicly funded journalism. When Starmer was asked directly whether he believed the BBC was still fit for purpose, his answer, "We must let the internal review take its course," drew laughter in the Commons. Opposition MPs shouted, "You're afraid to say it." This exchange, caught on camera and replayed millions of times on social media, became the viral moment titled, "UK Parliament bursts into laughter over Starmer's silence." An online poll conducted by YouGov found that 41% of respondents now believed Starmer is hiding something related to the BBC affair. Another 35% said they felt less trust in his leadership. Meanwhile, conservative strategists quietly began using the phrase, "Kick him out," not officially, but as a whisper campaign suggesting Starmer's days might be numbered. The result? The phrase "Starmer to be kicked out" exploded across thumbnails and headlines, giving rise to this very narrative. In moments like these, the shadow cabinet often becomes a mirror of loyalty and fear. Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner reportedly urged calm, telling colleagues, "We cannot be seen fighting among ourselves when the BBC is under attack. We stand together." But not everyone agreed. One anonymous frontbencher told Politico Europe, "This isn't about unity anymore. It's about accountability. If Keir doesn't lead decisively, someone else will." Names like Wes Streeting, Rachel Reeves, and Lisa Nandy have been quietly mentioned as potential successors. Not because they're plotting a coup, but because the conversation about post-Starmer Labour has now begun. The story's global reach cannot be underestimated. American media outlets such as Fox News and Newsmax quickly picked up the BBC scandal, portraying it as proof of bias in Western media. When Trump himself mentioned it during a rally in Florida, saying, "Even the BBC has been caught lying, and the British Prime Minister is protecting them," the clip went viral overnight. That statement alone sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles, putting Starmer in an impossible position: respond and risk escalating tensions with the U.S. election frontrunner, stay silent and appear weak at home. Either way, his image took another hit. By the end of this chaotic week, political journalists began talking openly about a timeline of collapse. According to The Spectator, if Starmer's approval ratings continue to fall in the BBC's internal investigation confirms misconduct, the pressure for him to step aside could become unstoppable. Some within Westminster believe the situation is already beyond repair. A quote from one insider summed it up. "He's not going to be kicked out tomorrow, but the machinery of doubt has started moving, and once it starts, it rarely stops." Keir Starmer may have survived this week, but survival isn't victory. The BBC scandal has cracked open a larger question. Can Britain's leader stand firm when his own allies, institutions, and the world's cameras are watching him unravel? Coming up next in Part 3, Inside the Commons, how the laughter, heckles, and chaos revealed the toxic heart of British politics. The moment the BBC Trump scandal entered the floor of the House of Commons, everything changed. What had begun as a media controversy suddenly exploded into a full political drama, and the atmosphere inside Parliament was unlike anything Westminster had seen in months. The Prime Minister walked in expecting routine questioning. Instead, he stepped into a chamber ready to erupt. As Keir Starmer stood at the dispatch box, the tension was already obvious. Several MPs were whispering, others smirking, and some visibly preparing lines they had practiced for hours. The Speaker attempted to bring order, but the energy inside the room was electric. Cameras were rolling, journalists were waiting, and millions would soon watch the moment that turned into a viral sensation. It began when an opposition MP rose, holding a printed copy of the BBC documentary transcript. The chamber went silent. He asked the Prime Minister to explain why publicly funded journalists had edited the speech of a former U.S. president in a way that misrepresented events. It was a sharp, direct, and politically loaded question. Starmer shifted slightly, clearing his throat, and delivered a carefully worded answer about trusting the internal review. And that's when it happened. Laughter broke out, unexpected, loud, and mocking. First from the Conservative benches, then spreading across the chamber. The Speaker shouted for order, but the damage was done. The cameras captured Starmer pausing mid-sentence, blinking in frustration as MPs shouted, "Answer the question! And you're dodging it!" The viral clip shows a few MPs even covering their mouths, trying to hide their reactions. One was heard saying, "He can't even defend the BBC anymore." Another sarcastically shouted, "Strong leadership, is it?" This was not a routine Commons moment. This was Parliament signaling weakness, not in the institution, but in the man leading it. Starmer attempted to regain control, insisting he supported accountability and transparency, but the mocking tone inside the chamber overwhelmed his message. Every time he referenced the BBC, more laughter followed. When he mentioned foreign influence, someone shouted, "Looks like they have more influence than you." The Speaker intervened again, but the Prime Minister's authority had already taken a visible hit. The moment that went most viral happened next. A Conservative MP asked whether the Prime Minister condemned the toxic culture inside the BBC, a phrase that had been trending after whistleblowers revealed internal pressure and editorial manipulation. Starmer began to answer, but the laughter returned even louder. The MP smirked and said, "Prime Minister, the country is laughing." 2. That clip alone spread across social media within minutes. Throughout the session, the term toxic culture hung heavily in the air. MPs repeated it, journalists tweeted it instantly, and political commentators started debating it in real time. It wasn't only about the documentary now. It was about what the scandal revealed. The broadcaster facing allegations of bias, a public institution in crisis, and a Prime Minister struggling to navigate the fallout. The live reaction in the Commons laid everything bare. There was no editing, no spin, just the raw, unfiltered reaction of elected officials watching their leader stumble. The body language said more than the speeches. Starmer's responses became shorter. His tone wavered. His posture stiffened. He looked like someone suddenly aware that control was slipping. What made this moment even worse for him was how quickly the media outside amplified it. News outlets replayed the clip on loop. Social media analysts pointed out how rarely a Prime Minister gets laughed at on the floor of Parliament, and how historically, moments like these mark turning points in political careers. Even neutral commentators described the session as brutal and embarrassing. Political strategists watching from outside, Westminster understood the symbolism immediately. When Parliament laughs at a Prime Minister, they aren't laughing at a joke. They're laughing at weakness. And once the public sees that, confidence becomes difficult to restore. Viewers across the country watched the exchange and interpreted it not just as a BBC scandal, but as a sign of a deeper leadership problem. The clip circulated on TikTok, X, Facebook, and YouTube, with captions like "Starmer loses Parliament," "UK MPs mock Prime Minister," and "This is getting out of control." Late night. Shows picked it up. Commentators jumped on it. And suddenly the story was everywhere, far beyond the documentary itself. But inside the Commons, the damage wasn't just public. You could see Labour MPs uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, trying to avoid the cameras. The looks they exchanged told a silent story. Frustration, anxiety, and confusion about how the Prime Minister had allowed the situation to spiral like this. And as soon as the session ended, journalists swarmed the hallways, asking one question again and again. Is Starmer losing authority? Behind the scenes, advisors reportedly knew the optics were disastrous. Several Labour MPs avoided interviews that day. Others attempted weak defenses, insisting it was all theatrics, but the public wasn't buying it. People weren't reacting to political theater. They were reacting to a prime minister, looking uncertain while his opponents laughed in his face. That session in Parliament didn't decide Starmer's future, but it changed the mood dramatically. It created the impression of a leader cornered, caught between defending a broadcaster, under fire, and responding to a global, political figure threatening legal action. It made him look reactive, not decisive. And worst of all, it handed his opponents a clear narrative that the Prime Minister is struggling to control institutions, the media, and even his own political story. By the time Starmer left the chamber, the headlines were already being written, and none of them were favorable. What should have been a moment of firm leadership turned into a moment of public humiliation, played out on the world stage. And from that point onward, the question wasn't just about the BBC. It was about Starmer, himself, his judgment, his authority, and whether he still appeared strong enough to lead Britain through the storm that had now fully engulfed his government. This Commons clash didn't end the scandal. It escalated it. And it set the tone for the days to come, where every move Starmer made would be scrutinized, every word parsed, and every silence interpreted as weakness. The laughter in Parliament may have lasted only seconds, but the political damage it caused was far more lasting. Outside the walls of Parliament, the reaction to the BBC Trump scandal and Starmer's troubled performance spread at lightning speed. What happened inside the Commons didn't stay in Westminster. It immediately spilled onto television screens, social feeds, and newsrooms across the world. And the fallout grew far beyond what anyone in government had anticipated. The first wave came from the media. Every major British outlet replayed the Commons clip on loop. The BBC itself, now under intense scrutiny, was forced to cover the story despite being directly involved. Sky News ran it with harsh analysis. ITV highlighted the laughter moment repeatedly, and online outlets framed Starmer as rattled and visibly shaken. Political journalists, who normally caution their language, suddenly started using words like humiliation, chaos, and loss of authority. At the same time, YouTube and TikTok commentators amplified the drama further. Channels specializing in UK politics quickly published breakdowns of the scandal, many receiving hundreds of thousands of views in hours. Clips of Starmer being mocked in Parliament turned into memes, side-by-side comparisons between his calm pre-scandal speeches and his tense performance during the Commons session went viral. The story wasn't just political news anymore. It had become entertainment, something people watched the way they watch a dramatic series unfold. But what truly intensified the fallout was the international angle. In the United States, the scandal was picked up by conservative networks almost instantly. Fox News questioned how the BBC, a publicly funded UK broadcaster, could edit one of the most controversial speeches of the decade. Newsmax and One America News ran segments questioning the credibility of Western media, using the BBC as a prime example. Prominent American commentators claimed the documentary's edit proved institutional bias, and they raised questions about how such an error could happen unless driven by ideology. This narrative grew even louder when Donald Trump himself referenced the scandal during a rally in front of thousands. He declared that the BBC had been caught manipulating the truth, and that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom was protecting a corrupt broadcaster. Whether one agrees with Trump or not, his comments had global influence, and they immediately shifted the story from a national controversy to an international flashpoint. Suddenly, Starmer was no longer dealing with a domestic scandal. He was dealing with a diplomatic headache, a powerful, global figure publicly attacking the UK's most iconic media institution, while millions watched the Prime Minister struggle to respond. Starmer's silence on Trump's remarks was heavily criticized. Analysts argued he appeared unsure whether to confront the former president or ignore him, worried that the wrong move could ignite an even bigger political firestorm. Meanwhile, public reaction in Britain was growing more intense. Polling companies began capturing the shift almost overnight. A large segment of the public said they didn't trust the BBC's handling of the documentary. Others said they didn't trust the Prime Minister's explanation. But the most damaging statistic was the number of people who felt Starmer was avoiding responsibility. That perception, once formed, is incredibly difficult for any leader to reverse. Online forums and comment sections were flooded with debate. Some defended Starmer, arguing that he was being unfairly attacked over an issue he didn't directly cause. Others questioned why he seemed hesitant to take a stronger stance. Even among Labour supporters, frustration grew. Many wondered why the government wasn't responding more aggressively to the scandal or reassuring the public more clearly. Then came the second blow, leaks from inside the BBC itself. Whistleblowers began sharing allegations that the editing team behind the documentary had raised internal concerns about the clip before it aired. Some claimed there was editorial pressure to present Trump negatively. Others hinted at a workplace culture where speaking up was discouraged. These leaks were explosive. Not only did they reinforce the idea of a toxic culture, but they painted a picture of an institution struggling with internal conflict, politicization, and mismanagement. The media devoured these leaks. Talk shows invited former BBC employees to share their experiences. Editorials questioned whether the broadcaster's leadership had lost control. Senior journalists demanded answers about how such a high-profile documentary could be mishandled so badly. And with every new revelation, the public trust in the BBC continued to erode. Starmer's government attempted damage control, but each appearance by a minister seemed to create more questions. The message was inconsistent. Some ministers defended the BBC completely, others hinted at the need for reform, and a few even suggested that the documentary's errors were unacceptable, contradicting Starmer's earlier defense. This inconsistency added to the perception of a government struggling to stay coordinated. International reactions also evolved. European media outlets framed the story as an example of Western political instability. Commentators in Canada and Australia questioned how a broadcaster once considered the gold standard of journalism could be involved in such controversy. The BBC was no longer just dealing with a national scandal. Its global reputation was now at stake. Through all of this, public conversation intensified. People began debating larger questions. Is the UK's media system broken? Are political leaders, too, closely tied to the institutions they're supposed to regulate? And can the Prime Minister maintain credibility when his own Parliament had openly mocked him? Slowly, the political narrative shifted from a discussion about the BBC documentary to a broader question about leadership. Commentators began saying that Starmer was losing control of the storyline, that the scandal had consumed his government, and that he needed to take decisive action before things spiraled further. But days passed and no bold action came. No major statement, no firm condemnation, no aggressive reform plan. The absence of clarity allowed the scandal to grow even bigger. By the end of the week, political observers were describing the fallout as one of the most damaging episodes of Starmer's premiership. What should have been a manageable media mistake had become a symbol of his weaknesses and indecision, overcaution, and a failure to command authority when it mattered most. The story had moved far beyond the BBC edit. It had become a test of the Prime Minister's leadership under pressure. And as the media kept pushing, the public kept reacting, and global voices kept weighing in, the question became more pressing. How long could Starmer withstand the mounting pressure? The fallout was far from over, and the next phase would determine whether this scandal remained a temporary embarrassment or evolved into a genuine political crisis, capable of threatening his position. As the scandal continued to expand, a new question began to dominate political conversations across the country. What happens next? The BBC documentary controversy was no longer just a media issue. It had evolved into something bigger, a test of Starmer's authority, his ability to control his own government, and his capacity to lead during a crisis. Behind closed doors in Westminster, anxiety grew. MPs from Starmer's own party started whispering among themselves, not yet in public but in private meetings, late-night text groups, and quiet conversations in corridors. Many of them weren't angry about the BBC edit itself. They were worried about Starmer's reaction, or rather, his lack of one. For days he seemed unsure, passive, and reactive. That hesitation made MPs wonder whether he could handle even larger crises. Some Labour MPs feared that this scandal could leave a permanent mark. They worried about the slow and cautious response, the missed opportunities to show leadership, and the way the Conservative Party was using the laughter moment as a symbol of his weakness. They knew how public perception works. Once a leader looks rattled, once the public senses uncertainty, that image can stick. and Starmer was now fighting against that image. Meanwhile, the Conservative opposition sharpened their attack. They framed the scandal not as a BBC problem, but as a Starmer problem, a failure of leadership, a sign that the Prime Minister was out of his depth. Every TV appearance, every interview, every debate became an opportunity for Tory MPs to repeat the same message. Starmer can't control the narrative. Starmer can't control his government. Starmer can't even control the BBC. Opposition strategists knew this moment was dangerous for the Prime Minister. They replayed the laughter clip in ads, highlighted his hesitant body language, and emphasized how quickly he seemed to lose the room. Their goal was simple, not just to attack his decisions, but to undermine his authority at its core. Political analysts began comparing the situation to historical moments where British leaders, from Theresa May to Gordon Brown, lost momentum after a single turning point. A moment that seemed small at first, but later became symbolic of deeper problems. And many wondered if this BBC Trump scandal would be that moment for Starmer. But the real threat didn't come from Parliament or the media. It came from the public. Day by day, Starmer's approval ratings continued to slip. Nothing dramatic. Not a collapse, not a crash, but a steady, slow decline. And those steady declines are often the hardest to reverse. People didn't suddenly dislike him. They simply began doubting his strength. In politics, doubt is deadly. The question growing louder each day was simple. Could Starmer survive this? Not in the literal sense of resigning immediately, but politically, reputationally, and strategically. Could he rebuild trust? Could he regain authority? Or had the damage already taken root? As the scandal entered its final stretch, Starmer faced a defining moment. Either he would finally take decisive action, reform, accountability, clarity, or the perception of weakness would linger, shaping every future controversy, every debate, and every election question. The episode ended not with a dramatic collapse, but with a quiet, uneasy uncertainty, the kind that hangs in political air for months, shaping decisions behind the scenes. The Prime Minister remained in office, but not untouched, marked, weakened, and watched more closely than ever before. And as commentators summed it up, this scandal may not have been the biggest crisis of his career, but it was the one that exposed the cracks. The one that showed how quickly laughter in Parliament can turn into pressure on the streets. The one that reminded everyone how fragile political authority can be. Whether Starmer rises above this moment or is slowly brought down by it is now a question only time will answer. But one thing is certain. The BBC Trump scandal has changed the political landscape, shaken public trust, and left a shadow on the Prime Minister's leadership that will follow him long after the clips stop trending. And before we end this report, make sure you subscribe to Echo Storm for more sharp updates, deep analysis, and breaking stories from across the UK and beyond. Your support keeps this channel growing. Stay tuned, stay informed, and stay ahead.